I really love, and I mean really love, college football season, but I also like this time of the year where everybody's team is undefeated. Everybody thinks that their team has a chance to make it to the playoffs. Well, I'm here to eliminate most of those dreams and give you an actual list of the teams that have an actual chance to make it to the playoffs. There's only about 6. Let's go. What's going on, everybody? It's me again, Go to Blue Dude, and if you haven't already, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. Go ahead, do it now. I do college football videos every single day. Hey, if you're a subscriber, don't forget to share this video. Right now, we're in the era of equality when it comes to society. College football isn't quite there yet. Not everybody has a legitimate shot to make it to the playoffs. In fact, I came up with a list, and really there's only about 6 teams that have a legitimate shot at making the playoffs. But I wanted to extend my optimism and give you some other positive news that could concern your teams. The first quick thing I want to go over is the possible surprises in each conference. We'll start with the group of 5. In the AAC, I think SMU could be a big surprise. They have a lot of talent coming back. Finish sort of middle of the pack. I think they'll take a step forward. For Conference USA, I'm really keeping my eye on Western Kentucky. The Hilltoppers could surprise some people in Conference USA. For the Sun Belt, Arkansas State, I actually thought that they were going to have a better season than what they did. Well, this coming season, they will. In the Mountain West, Nevada is right up there near the top, but I think this coming year they will get to the top. And in the MAC, Ohio, they are poised to make a good jump and contend for the MAC championship. In the Pac-12, to me, it's not really a surprise, but to everybody else, it could be Arizona State with Jalen Daniels. In the Big Ten, this is more of a repercussion from last year. Penn State, they just had a horrific year, so any sort of good season this year will be a big step forward, and it will be a good season for Penn State. For the ACC, Louisville, same situation. They took a step backwards, and I thought they would take a step forward. Well, they have the talent to have a much better season than they did last year. In the Big 12, Kansas State, I have Kansas State possibly crashing the Big 12 party. It depends on how well they play Oklahoma and Iowa State. Then in the SEC, well, this might not be a surprise because everybody's talking about them, Ole Miss. Lane Kiffin already doing great things over there, especially with the offense. And now for the honorable mentions list as far as possibly making the playoffs. Out of the Sun Belt, Coastal Carolina. They returned pretty much everybody, but they're in the Sun Belt. Liberty, same situation, but they're an independent and play a mostly group of 5 schedule. Same situation for Louisiana. They're in the Sun Belt. That's the thing that's going to really hurt them as far as trying to get to the playoffs. In the Big Ten, Wisconsin, I think they're going to be a really good team. I just think the Big Ten is going to beat up on each other. In the Pac-12, Arizona State, I definitely think they have the talent to make a challenge for the playoffs, but one loss in the Pac-12 and you're pretty much out of the playoff race. The SEC, Texas A&M, I think they're going to be not quite as good as they were last year. They might be in the conversation towards the end of the year, but by the end of the year, they'll be out of the conversation. Notre Dame, they lose some key pieces. They have a tough schedule. It's the schedule that keeps them off my playoff list. Back to the Big Ten, Ohio State, same scenario as Wisconsin. I think Ohio State will be a good team, but the Big Ten will beat up on each other. Cincinnati in the AAC, they could make a legitimate run at a playoff spot, but they are in a group of 5. They can't afford any losses, and they need help from other people. And the last team on my honorable mentions is going to be the Miami Hurricanes. They're going to have a ton of talent coming back. The problem is that schedule, it's brutal. They'll have one of their better teams that they've had in the past 10-15 years. I kind of feel bad for them. That's just an unfortunate set of circumstances for the Canes. Now it's time to talk about teams that actually have an actual chance to make it to the playoffs. The whole point of this video. The first team is Iowa State. Last year they finished 9-3, ranked 9th in the nation. They do return quarterback Brock Purdy, running back Breece Hall. That's a big deal right there. Tight end Charlie Kohler, he'll be back, and a ton of great wide receivers, including Xavier Hutchinson, Tariq Milton, Sean Shaw Jr., I love saying that name, Daniel Jackson, and Darren Wilson Jr., also great wide receivers, and Darian Porter and Joe Skates. Keep an eye on the receivers at Iowa State. It's going to be a great unit. Also, Iowa State has a legitimate defensive line with Isaiah Lee, J.R. Singleton, Howard Brown. Ewires are right. They do have a big loss in losing Lawrence White, but they have a lot coming back on defense. The secondary loaded with experience and skill, and it comes back mostly intact for 2021. The big thing for Iowa State is running the ball against Iowa State in 2021 is going to be very, very difficult. I'm more concerned about the pass defense, but that should also be legitimate in 2021. Check out these numbers. This is returning production. They return 88.9% of interception production, 88.9% of pass deflection production, 80.4% of tackle production, and 70.1% of tackles for loss production, 62.1% of sacks production, 99% of their passing yards production, 85.4% of their rushing yard production, 82% of their receiving production, and 100% of their offensive snaps production. So as good as Iowa State was last year, they're going to be even better in 2021. The problem is the schedule. Here's their schedule. They start off with a home game against Northern Iowa, then another home game against Iowa, then a road game to UNLV. That's weird. Then at Baylor, then they get Kansas at home, at Kansas State. That could be a tricky game. Oklahoma State at home. Tough road game at West Virginia. A home game against Texas, at Texas Tech, at Oklahoma. That is a brutal back-to-back road schedule. And they finish the season with a home game against TCU. It's those road trips to Kansas State, West Virginia, and Oklahoma that concerns me the most for Iowa State. They have the talent to win 2 out of those 3. Oklahoma will be the most difficult. And to get into the playoffs, they will have to beat Oklahoma at least one time. If they don't do it in the regular season, they'll have to do it in the Big 12 championship. That's a tall order. That's why I'm giving Iowa State just a 30% chance of getting to the playoffs. They have the skill, but the schedule, not all that great. And don't forget the home rivalry game against Iowa. That could be a trip-up game as well. Next up on this list is North Carolina. Last year, they finished 8-4, ranked number 18 in the nation. Their big losses, well, they lost both their running backs, Javonte Williams and Michael Carter. Lost a couple of good wide receivers too, Diami Brown and Daz Newsome. But quarterback Sam Howell, he's back. And they have a great potential running back in Kamaro Edwards. Don't forget about running backs British Brooks and Josh Henderson. So I think they'll be fine at running back. Not as good, but fine. All 5 starters on the offensive line, they're going to be back. And he has a good wide receiving core. Wide receiver Beau Corrales, he's back from an injury. That's a great get back for North Carolina. Wide receiver Josh Downs, Emory Simmons, Caffrey Brown, the younger brother of Diami Brown, he's there. They're saying he could possibly be better than Diami. And wide receiver Gavin Blackwell. They get 10 starters returning on defense. Really, the only big loss for them is linebacker Chaz Surratt, but the entire front 7 will be back. And I think that linebacker Jeremiah Gamel, he will help to make the loss of Chaz Surratt not hurt as much. And of course, Trey Morrison, he'll lead the secondary. Jay Bateman, the defensive coordinator for North Carolina, has that defense headed in the right direction. Let's look at their schedule. They start off with the road trip to Virginia Tech. It's tough in Blacksburg, but Virginia Tech is no good. I expect North Carolina to win that game. Then a home game against Georgia State. Can't look over the Panthers. They're a good team. Home game against Virginia at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech's getting better. Home game against Duke. Home game against Florida State, then a home game against Miami. So that's a 3-game stretch of home ACC games. And I expect them to win all 3, yes, including that home game against Miami. Then a road trip to Notre Dame. No, Notre Dame on the road. Trust me, it's going to be fine. Notre Dame loses a lot of talent. Notre Dame is one of the quietest stadiums in the nation, so don't worry about home field advantage for Notre Dame. A home game against Wake Forest, and then at Pitt. Don't look past Pitt. Then a home game against Wofford, and then at NC State. So a tough way to end the year, 2 out of 3 on the road, but North Carolina is the better team. I give North Carolina about a 50-50 shot to make it to the playoffs. They definitely have the skill. The schedule isn't horrible, they just can't have letdown games. If North Carolina plays consistently and to the level that they're capable of, they should have a legitimate shot to make it to the playoffs. Next on this list, Alabama, of course. Last year they finished 13-0, number 1 in the nation, national champions. They do have a lot of key losses on offense though, including quarterback Mac Jones, running back Najee Harris, wide receivers Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle. That's a lot of production Alabama has to replace. Leading the way this year will be quarterback Bryce Young and running back Brian Robinson. He's very highly talented and he has some skill. Decent wide receiver core, Josh Mechie, Slade Bolden, Javon Baker, and Xavier Williams. That's a decent wide receiver core, just not as good as last year's, but they could develop into maybe as good as last year's. They get 7 starters on defense. Their biggest losses, of course, linebacker Dylan Jalen Moses, and cornerback Patrick Surtain. That was the big one, Patrick Surtain. And don't forget that they do have a new offensive coordinator in Bill O'Brien. So a lot of adjusting for Alabama. But Alabama is Alabama, and they always have great recruiting classes. Let's look at their schedule. First game, they get a game against Miami in Atlanta. If De'Aaron King is 100%, that could definitely be a problem game for Alabama. But I do think Alabama wins that game. They get Mercer at home, then at Florida. Don't worry about Florida. They lose pretty much everybody. A home game against Southern Miss. A home game against Ole Miss. That's a big deal. Ole Miss gave Alabama some fits last year. So I think it being at home gives Alabama the edge. At Texas A&M, not really worried about that. The atmosphere might mess with Alabama, especially since they're young. So I would keep my eye on that game, but I'm not too worried about it. And at Mississippi State, Mike Leach, the air raid offense, got to deal with that. Home against Tennessee. Home against LSU. I think LSU will be much better than last year. And LSU has beaten Alabama in Alabama recently, so they do have the confidence to pull it off. Then a home game against New Mexico State, home game against Arkansas, and then a road game to Auburn. Auburn not going to be all that good, but it is a rivalry game on the road to end the season. And I do expect Alabama to have maybe one loss during the regular season, so I think they will need to win the SEC championship, and I think they'll play Georgia. That's going to be a good game. So I give Alabama a 70% chance to make the playoffs. A couple of things here. Number one, Alabama is Alabama. Number two, I expect the other teams to probably play their way out. So Alabama will have the advantage, and they will be capable of winning the SEC again. Next on this list, Oklahoma. They finished 9-2, number 6 in the nation. That's a good finish. Leading the way for Oklahoma is quarterback Spencer Rattler, and they do get running back Kennedy Brooks back. He's a good running back. A great wide receiving core in Marvin Mims, Theo Weiss, Drake Stoops, Jaden Hasselwood, and Oklahoma could possibly have the best offensive line in the nation. The defense returned 7 starters, and really the only big losses were defensive end Ronnie Perkins and cornerback Trey Norwood. But I do think the defense will be even better in 2021. Defensive coordinator Alex Grinch has Oklahoma looking like they actually have a defense in the Big 12. Yep, you better believe it. And he'll have plenty of experience, plenty of skill to work with. I do expect that defense to take a step forward. Oklahoma's going to be a dangerous team in 2021. Let's look at their schedule. They start off the year with a road trip to Tulane. They come back home to Western Carolina and a home game against Nebraska and a home game against West Virginia. I expect all those to be wins. And then a tricky road game to Kansas State. And Kansas State has had Oklahoma's number. And then get Texas in Dallas. Shouldn't be any problem. And a home game against TCU at Kansas. Home against Texas Tech at Baylor. Home against Iowa State. That's a big one. And then at Oklahoma State. Oklahoma can't afford one loss, and that would be either Kansas State or Iowa State, but then win the Big 12 and you're in the playoffs. So I give Oklahoma a 75% chance to make the playoffs. Next up on this list, Clemson, of course. They finished 10-2, number 3 in the nation. They lost some production on the offense. They lost quarterback Trevor Lawrence, running back Travis Etienne, and wide receiver Amari Rodgers, but they have talent. Quarterback DJ Ungalele looks really, really good. Their new running back Will Shipley, he looks great. But he will be battling Lynn J. Dixon for the starting spot for running back. They have a great wide receiver core this year. Collins, he's the one that I think that will lead this group. Frank Ladson Jr., Joe Nagata. Don't forget about Justin Ross. He is recovering from surgery. He hasn't had full contact yet, but he's a great receiver. Clemson's biggest problem last year was the line of scrimmage, offensively and defensively. I think that gets cleaned up. It'll be much better. This will look more like the dominating Clemson that we're used to. It might take a minute for that offense to gel and come together because they are young, but that defense is going to be impressive. They returned 10 starters. So until that offense is fully cohesive, the defense will have to carry them. Let's look at their schedule. Start off with the neutral game against Georgia in Atlanta. I do think that's a loss for Clemson. It's early in the year and it's against possibly one of the best teams in the nation. Don't freak out. It'll be a close game, but I do have the Dogs winning. But from there, they have a home game against SC State, a home game against Georgia Tech, at NC State, who will be better, but Clemson far superior, a home game against Boston College, at Syracuse, and yes, Syracuse has given them fits, but Syracuse is falling off a cliff right now. And at Pitt, you can't look past Pitt either. They've given you fits too. Home against Florida State, at Louisville. Louisville rebounding, could be a surprise team. Home against Wake Forest, and then at South Carolina. Now, I do think that Clemson loses to Georgia in that first game, but after that, I think they win the rest of their regular season games, get to the ACC championship, and win in a close game against a talented North Carolina team, and that's what gets Clemson into the playoffs. I'm giving Clemson an 80% chance of making the playoffs. That just leaves us with one team, and that is Georgia. Last year they finished 8-2, number 7 in the nation. Man, they are loaded on offense. Quarterback JT Daniels, running back Zamir White, tight end Darnell Washington, wide receivers Curious Jackson, Jermaine Burton, Dominic Blaylock, Arian Smith. Yes, George Pickens did injure his ACL and will have surgery, but they possibly could get him back about halfway through the season. But there's enough talent there on offense where that won't hurt as much. Defense got a much needed boost by getting transferred Tyke Smith from West Virginia. There are a few key losses that they'll have to feel, but I think it'll be fine. They start off the season against Clemson. I think that's a big win for Georgia and slingshots them into the 2021 season. After that, a home game against UAB, a home game against South Carolina. Don't play down to South Carolina. That's how they beat you. If you play to your potential, you will slaughter South Carolina. After that, at Vanderbilt, a home game against Arkansas, at Auburn. That could be tricky. I know Auburn's not all that great, but Jordan-Hare, especially at full capacity, is tough to win at. Then a home game against Kentucky, neutral game against Florida. Not worried about that. Florida's going to suck. Home against Missouri, at Tennessee, home against Charleston Southern, and then at Georgia Tech. That's a rivalry game. Y'all own Georgia Tech, but Georgia Tech is getting better. Don't play down to their level. So I expect Georgia to possibly go undefeated, but worst case scenario, one loss, get to the SEC championship, battle Alabama, and finally get over the hump and beat Alabama to get into the playoffs. I give Georgia an 85% chance to get to the playoffs. That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.